June 4th, 1944. 11:21 a.m. Atlantic Ocean, 150 miles west of Cape Blanco, French West Africa. A violent concussion rips through the steel spine of U-505. Light bulbs burst. Men are hurled from their bunks. Somewhere deep in the hull, something shrieks like tortured metal. Captain Lieutenant Harold Lang slams into a bulkhead as the deck pitches under his boots. The boat lurches downward, then up, then sideways. Depth charges. Close. Too close. Inside the submarine, the air is already sour with diesel, sweat, and battery acid. Now it fills with something worse. Burning insulation, hot oil, panic. Alarm! Alarm! The klaxon wails. Red lights flicker. The U-boat is wounded. In the control room, sailors fight to keep their balance as gauges spin and valves scream. Water jets through a ruptured pipe, icy and violent. The boat shudders again. Another explosion. The sound doesn't come through the water anymore. It comes through the hull. You can almost feel it in your teeth. Lang forces himself upright. His face is streaked with blood. His eyes dart to the depth gauge. Too shallow. They're being driven up. Above them, the Atlantic is no longer empty. It is crowded with enemies. The American hunter-killer group, Task Group 22.3, has found its prey. The escort carrier USS Guadalcanal circles like a patient predator. Below her, destroyer escorts, USS Chatelaine, Pillsbury, Pope, Flaherty, Jenks, carve white scars across the ocean surface, their sonar pings hammering into the deep. They know exactly where U-505 is. On the bridge of the Chatelaine, a sonar operator has not moved in minutes. His headset presses deep into his ears. Every return, every echo, every ghost of sound has been stripped away until only one remains. A steel coffin moving under the sea. Contact steady, he says. And then the order comes. Fire. Depth charges roll from the racks. Hedgehog mortars cough their spined projectiles forward. The ocean erupts. Columns of water punch the sky. Shock waves race outward like invisible fists. Down below, in U-505, men are thrown against valves, against each other, against fate. The lights die. Darkness. Someone screams in German. Someone else is praying. Another man is laughing, a thin, cracking sound that doesn't belong to humor. Water is coming in faster now. The trim is wrong. The boat is no longer answering her rudder the way she should. Lange tastes copper. He doesn't need instruments to know what's happening. He has commanded U-boats long enough. They are beaten. He forces the words out. Auftauchen. Surface the boat. The order moves like electricity. Ballast is blown. Compressed air roars. The deck angles sharply upward. The sea rushes back. With a violent surge, U-505 bursts through the Atlantic, her conning tower exploding into daylight and spray. For a fraction of a second, everything is eerily quiet. Then the Americans open fire. Machine guns chatter from the destroyers. Shells crack across the water. Bullets stitch the tower. Splinters of steel scream through the air. German sailors spill onto the deck, half blind, choking, hands in the air. Some jump. Some fall. Some simply collapse where they stand. Lang climbs after them, his cap gone, hair plastered to his skull. He looks out across the waves and freezes. American ships. Not one. Not two. A ring of them. Close. Too close. The U-boat is dead in the water, smoke drifting from her vents, deck slick with oil and blood. An American shell punches through the hull near the bow. Another tears into the bridge rail. This is the moment most U-boat commanders prepare for from the day they leave Kiel. The last act. Scuttling. Lang gives the order. Open the sea valves. Destroy all documents. Abandon ship. Men rush back inside the dying submarine, not to save her, but to kill her. Seacocks are wrenched open. Water floods in. Enigma machines are smashed. Codebooks are ripped apart. Classified charts are torn, weighted, hurled into the bilges. The boat begins to list. One by one, the crew dives over the side into the cold Atlantic. Oil coats the surface, burning the eyes, choking the throat. Debris floats. Men shout. Some don't move at all. Lang jumps last. Behind him, U-505 is settling. Her stern dips. Water climbs her casing. She is doing what every German submarine is meant to do when captured. She's going to take her secrets with her. Except, she doesn't. On the bridge of the USS Pillsbury, an American officer watches through binoculars. The U-boat is still moving forward. Her screws are still turning. Slowly, blindly. No one aboard her. A ghost ship. "Captain," someone says, disbelief in his voice. She's not going under. Orders crackle over radios. A boarding party is formed in seconds. Not tomorrow. Not after she sinks. Now, a small boat is lowered. Sailors climb down nets with pistols in their teeth and knives in their belts. The Atlantic heaves beneath them as they race toward the drifting enemy submarine. From the water, German survivors watch. They expect an explosion. They expect the hull to vanish. They expect the Atlantic to close forever over you. 505. Instead, they see something impossible. American sailors are climbing onto her deck. Men disappear into the conning tower. Inside their boat. Inside their war. And in that moment, floating in oil and salt, watching the enemy swarm over what was once the pride of the Kriegsmarine, a thought begins to take shape among the survivors. A cold one. What if she doesn't sink? What if the sea has already chosen a side? The enemy walks through their boat. The Atlantic is still alive with motion. Waves slap against floating bodies. Oil drifts in rainbow slicks. Wounded men cough seawater and fuel. Some cling to debris. Others to each other. All of them watch. The boarding boat bumps against the steel flank of U-505. An American sailor grabs a rail and hauls himself up. Then another. Then 5. More. They move fast. Too fast. They are not cautious men expecting a trap. They are practiced men executing a routine. Inside the submarine, Lieutenant, junior grade, Albert David leads the first team down through the conning tower hatch. The interior is dim, tilted, reeking of smoke and acid. Water sloshes around their boots. Somewhere deep in the hull, something hisses. A ticking sound. A demolition charge. David doesn't hesitate. He and his men spread out, pistols up, flashlights slicing through the gloom. They step over shattered gauges, smashed radio equipment, loose wires writhing like snakes. The control room looks like a butcher machine. They have seconds. A sailor finds the sea valves, already open, water roaring through them. He slams them shut. Another tears into the engine room, spinning wheels, killing motors. A third yanks wires free from a scuttling charge and flings it into a bucket of water. Upate nula pate shudders. Then slowly, she steadies. The rushing water slackens. The submarine stops dying. On the surface, the German sailors realize something is wrong. She should be gone by now. Instead, she is leveling out, staying afloat. Still, from the water, Captain Lieutenant Lang stares. Oil burns his eyes. Salt crusts his lips. He blinks hard, thinking it must be a hallucination born of concussion and shock. But it isn't. The American flag is already being raised. Not ceremonially, efficiently. A signalman snaps it into place. Red, white, and blue unfurls over a German warship for the first time in history. Around the drifting boat, destroyers ease closer, their guns still trained, their screws churning the water into foam. Loudspeakers crackle. German sailors in the water. Do not resist. We'll pick you up. Boats are lowered. Lines are thrown. Hands reach down. And the men of U-505, the hunted, are pulled, one by one, onto American decks. They expect fists. They expect rifle butts. They expect hatred. They do not expect what they see. Blankets. Water. Medics already kneeling. A sailor presses a canteen to Lang's lips. Fresh water. Cool. Clean. He drinks before he realizes what he's doing. Another American drapes a blanket over his shoulders. It smells like soap. Soap. They are searched quickly, disarmed, and guided to sitting positions along the deck. Some are shaking uncontrollably. Some are bleeding. Some just stare, eyes hollow, watching their boat being towed. Because now the impossible has happened. U-505 is not only afloat. She is under American control. Lines have been passed. Pumps are running. Damage control parties swarm over her casing, vanishing into hatches, emerging with charts, books, equipment. Things German sailors know should never fall into enemy hands. And still, no explosion comes. No final convulsión. No grave in the deep. Instead, the submarine begins to move. Not under her own power. Under tow. A captured predator being dragged across the sea like a netted shark. On the deck of the USS Guadalcanal, intelligence officers arrive almost immediately. They do not smile. They do not cheer. They move with the same quiet urgency as surgeons in an operating room. They have taken something priceless, and they intend to keep it. The German prisoners are separated, counted, photographed. Their names are written down, their ranks noted, their wounds dressed. They are not told where they are going. They are not told what has been taken from their boat. They are not told that, deep inside U-505, American sailors have already found intact Enigma cipher machines, codebooks, and operational charts. Secrets that could shorten the war. Secrets that might already be rewriting it. Instead, the Germans are led below decks, into clean compartments, electric lights, real beds, the vibration of powerful engines humming steadily beneath their feet, not the nervous, rattling tremor of a submarine hunted to exhaustion, but the deep, confident thrum of a surface fleet that knows the sea belongs to it. Hours later, wrapped in blankets, Lang sits on a bench and listens. He hears something he has not heard in years. Silence. No depth charges. No alarms. No frantic shouts for damage control. Just the steady slap of waves against a steel hull that is not afraid. Around him, his men whisper. They exchange glances. They ask the same questions in low voices. Why were we sunk? Why didn't they finish her? Why did they come aboard? U-boat doctrine is absolute. A captured submarine is a failure, a disgrace, an impossibility. The Allies destroy U-boats. They don't take them. Yet U-505 is behind them now, riding the ocean like a wounded animal that has been strangely spared. And in that mercy, something far more unsettling than destruction begins to creep in. If the Americans can afford to capture a U-boat, if they can risk men, time, and secrecy to preserve one, then perhaps they're no longer fighting for survival. Perhaps they're managing an outcome. The first German sailors are brought up on deck again as night falls. They expect to see the black Atlantic stretching in every direction. Instead, they see a horizon crowded with ships. Not escorts clinging nervously to a convoy, but an entire mobile base. A floating city of steel and antennas and lights. Radar masts rotating. Signal lamps blinking. Aircraft being recovered onto a carrier deck as casually as trucks pulling into a depot. One sailor grips the rail. Another laughs softly, without humor, because the ocean no longer looks empty. It looks owned. And somewhere deep inside men who have spent years believing the U-boat arm was Germany's unstoppable blade, a realization begins to form. They were not ambushed. They were found, tracked, surrounded, handled. And now, as U-505 disappears into the darkness behind the American fleet, they are about to discover just how deep that imbalance truly runs. The cruel normalcy of victory. Night had fallen over the Atlantic, but for U-505's German crew, the darkness did nothing to hide the enormity of what had just happened. The cold had seeped into their bones hours ago, yet now, wrapped in American blankets, the chill felt almost irrelevant. Below decks of the USS Guadalcanal, the prisoners shuffled through a maze of corridors, each turn revealing more of what they could only describe as a floating city. They had imagined the enemy as relentless hunters, as fanatical destroyers that would sink them without hesitation. Instead, they found mechanical efficiency, calm, and, most unnerving of all, control. Lieutenant Lang found a corner in a mess hall, his hands still shaking. Around him, his men stared silently at the deck beneath their feet. They had been trained to fear American destroyers and aircraft above all else. Now, instead of death, they were met with routine, almost casual competence. Through a hatchway, they could see sailors moving like clockwork, Engines being repaired, radios calibrated, aircraft being fueled, crates of supplies shifted without a word of panic. The noise was mechanical and precise, not the chaotic roar of combat they were used to. Lang realized the terrifying truth. The Atlantic War was no longer a gamble. It had been decided already. A young sailor, Unteroffizier Klaus Weber, whispered to his bunkmate. "They treat her like a museum piece. Not like a weapon," the other replied. "Like she belongs to them now." And in a way, she did. U-505 had survived everything the ocean could throw at her, only to be claimed and mastered by the enemy. It was an act of psychological dominance more than anything else. She was still a submarine, still armed, still formidable, yet she was powerless in the hands of men who could repair, catalog, and analyze her at leisure. In the following hours, Lang and his men were escorted to a small, makeshift interrogation room. American officers asked questions, names, ranks, patrol areas. The Germans answered cautiously. No one knew how much the Americans already knew, but one thing was painfully obvious. The U.S. Navy had already dissected U-505's value in their minds, and it was more than just a submarine. Down the hall, the submarine's compartments were being methodically inventoried. Engineers tested torpedo tubes. Electricians ran diagnostics. Cryptographers inspected the Enigma machine. Every action was deliberate, controlled. There was no panic, no fear of reprisal, only the precise, calculated motion of men who had already won the war in the Atlantic without needing to fire another shot. Weber watched from a corner as a sailor gently handled a waterlogged German codebook, drying it with towels. He couldn't comprehend it. He had been trained to believe that U-boats must be destroyed at all costs, that the sea owed them its silence. Instead, here it was alive, being preserved, and the Americans treated it with a detachment that made it more frightening than any depth charge. Lang's thoughts drifted back to the convoy attacks, the nights patrolling the cold North Atlantic, the constant fear of sonar pings and depth charges. All of it now felt pointless, as if the entire theater had shifted while he had been trapped underwater, waiting for a ship to sink him. Yet the Americans had moved with purpose, not panic. They had prepared, planned, and executed their control of the ocean long before he ever surfaced. It was in that quiet, in that terrifying normalcy, that Lang began to understand what had happened. The war had been lost, not in battle, but in organization, in resources, and foresight. Every U-boat, every patrol, every desperate maneuver seemed suddenly like a child throwing rocks at a fortress. They had been outmatched in ways that were invisible underwater, unseen from periscope depth. That night, the German crew slept fitfully, if at all, surrounded by the enemy they had feared most. Not men with guns, but men with control. When they drifted in and out of consciousness, they glimpsed scenes that would haunt them. Radar masts glinting in moonlight, aircraft being hoisted back onto carriers, stacks of supplies that seemed endless, and the silent, unwavering watch of destroyers patrolling the horizon. By dawn, it was clear that the Americans were not just capturing a submarine. They were capturing the minds of the men who had sailed her. Every crew member of U-505 had seen the impossible, an enemy that could afford to care for a captured weapon, that could treat it not as scrap metal, but as a strategic treasure. And the realization cut deeper than any depth charge. Lang stood at the railing, looking down at the calm ocean, now forgiving in its silence. He could see the dark silhouette of his once proud vessel gliding beside the American ship. For a moment, he almost forgot who had commanded her. He almost imagined that she was still his. Then he remembered. She was gone, and with her, perhaps the illusion of German supremacy in the Atlantic. He did not know yet that the story of U-505 would be told for decades, that her capture would give the Allies insights into Enigma codes and submarine tactics. All he knew was that he had witnessed the enemy walking through his boat, untouched, unafraid, as if the ocean itself had chosen sides. And far beneath the waves, men who had spent years believing in the invincibility of their weapon were beginning to realize that sometimes the war is lost long before the first shell strikes. Section 4. Inside the American fortress. The next morning, U-505 rested quietly alongside the USS Guadalcanal. For the German crew, the sight was almost unbearable. The submarine, once a predator of the Atlantic, now looked small and fragile beside the massive escort carrier and her protective fleet of destroyers. The Americans moved around her with a precision that seemed almost choreographed. Engines tuned, torpedo tubes inspected, radar tested, deck scrubbed, all as if she were a museum piece rather than a vessel of war. Captain Lieutenant Lang was escorted below deck again. He expected interrogations, drills, maybe even mockery. Instead, he found a stark contrast. Spotless bunks, functioning showers, the hum of engines beneath a steel floor that didn't shudder with panic or chaos. The crew of U-505 exchanged glances. They were trained to survive in claustrophobic, vibrating, dark spaces where one mistake meant death. Now, they moved through spaces that smelled of soap and polished metal. American officers appeared and began showing them the tools and technology that made this control possible. In one compartment, Lang saw rows of radar displays, their screens glowing with blips and arcs he had never imagined. Operators monitored the Atlantic in real time, watching every convoy, every patrol route, every shadow. In another room, sonar technicians replayed recordings from the previous night's hunt. The German crew watched, stunned, as their own hull sounds, their own attempts to evade, appeared as clear blips on a screen, dissected and cataloged by calm, methodical Americans. "Your mistakes, they were not random," an American officer said quietly, almost to himself. "We tracked, predicted, and waited." Lang felt a chill. He had been trained to assume the ocean itself could be an ally, that stealth and cunning were enough. Here, the sea was just another surface to be observed and controlled. The German sailors were then led to a small, sterile room where technicians carefully laid out the Enigma machine and codebooks recovered from the boat. Every page, every rotor, every key ring of codes was examined with the meticulous calm of scientists handling priceless artifacts. Lang recognized immediately what the Americans had in their hands: intelligence that could turn the tide of the war. Yet the Americans made no grand announcement. There were no speeches, no fanfare, only efficiency, only control. Every action, from drying water-damaged books to testing cipher machines, was calculated to extract maximum value. As the day wore on, the German crew was allowed to observe the larger fleet operations. From the deck of Guadalcanal, they saw planes being recovered, repaired, and refueled as if the ocean were nothing more than a parking lot. Destroyers patrolled tirelessly, their radar and sonar keeping track of an invisible enemy. Supplies were transferred with almost clinical efficiency. Lang realized what he was seeing was not improvisation. This was war as infrastructure, as strategy executed without desperation. The Americans did not fear the ocean, they dominated it. Every U-boat patrol, every convoy attack, every lost ship had been predicted, measured, and countered. And the most unnerving part? The captured submarine, U-505, was being treated not as a trophy, but as a tool in the larger machine. Her value was measured not in the pride of the Kriegsmarine, but in what she could teach the Americans about the German war effort. The prisoners began to understand the scale of what they were up against. They had assumed the war at sea was a contest of bravery and skill, of stealth and daring. Instead, they saw an industrialized, technological, and logistical behemoth. Every depth charge, every sonar ping, every ship in formation was part of a system that was decades ahead of anything they had known. Lang sat quietly that evening, listening to the hum of engines and the soft chatter of American sailors. He thought of his men, of the Atlantic they had once ruled with terror and secrecy. And he thought of the phrase that had haunted him since the boarding. The sea belongs to them now. For the crew of U-505, that realization was worse than death. Not because they would be killed, that had been avoided, but because they had glimpsed the inevitable. They had seen the American war machine in motion, and in their hearts, they knew that the battle for the Atlantic was already lost, long before their submarine had surfaced to be captured. Some sailors cried quietly. Others sat stiffly, staring into the night, trying to memorize every detail of the fleet, every radar mast, every orderly crew. Every German man who had once believed in the invincibility of the U-boat arm felt the slow, suffocating weight of defeat pressing down. And in the corner, Lang whispered to himself, words that would echo in his mind for the rest of the war. We have not been hunted, we have been studied. A thought that was more terrifying than any depth charge, more cruel than any capture. Because if the enemy can study, control, and manipulate the sea itself, then every German victory, every convoy raided, every patrol gone right, had been temporary and meaningless. The Americans had done more than capture a submarine. They had captured the psychology of their enemy. And in that moment, Lang realized the war was no longer about battles. It was about dominance that could not be fought at sea, dominance that had already been won. Confronting the Atlantic's new masters. The sun rose over the Atlantic, painting the deck of the USS Guadalcanal in gold and steel. For the German crew of U-505, it was a day that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The ocean, once their domain, now seemed foreign, calm, indifferent, and utterly controlled. Captain Lieutenant Lang and his officers were gathered on the flight deck. American intelligence officers moved among them with quiet efficiency, pointing out charts, explaining procedures, testing their knowledge of patrol routes. Lang watched, noting the casual confidence in every gesture. These men were not simply victorious. They were masters of the Atlantic, and they knew it. The German sailors were taken through the ship's operations. They saw radar rooms humming with activity, sonar displays tracking distant ships, aircraft maintenance crews working like a single organism. Each movement was purposeful, precise, and relentless. Every piece of equipment, every system, every sailor seemed synchronized toward total control of the ocean. Lange's stomach tightened. He realized that the Americans had turned the very tools of the sea, sonar, radar, intelligence, logistics, into a fortress afloat. U-boats had once struck fear into convoys with stealth and surprise. Now that fear was gone. Every move was anticipated, every shadow mapped, every submarine traceable. Below decks, the German officers were shown the U-boats' remains as the Americans examined every machine, every instrument, every chart. The Enigma machines, still intact, were being carefully cataloged. Codebooks, operational orders, torpedo diagrams, nothing was ignored. Lang understood instantly. The capture of U-505 was a turning point, not just a tactical victory, but an intelligence coup. Every secret that Germany had clung to for years was now in the hands of the enemy. The realization settled in with a cold weight. The Atlantic War had already shifted, and they had been powerless witnesses. The men had survived scuttling charges, depth charges, freezing water, and the crushing pressure of the deep. And yet, none of that had mattered. The real battle had been lost long before U-505 had surfaced in laboratories, planning rooms, and on the decks of ships that never panicked, never hesitated. Lang walked the deck, observing the fleet surrounding them. Destroyers, aircraft, and carriers moved in coordinated patterns that seemed almost choreographed, every element supporting the others. He remembered nights of patrolling alone, hoping to ambush convoys, imagining the ocean as an ally. Now he understood. The sea itself was irrelevant. The Americans had taken it, controlled it, owned it. In the distance, U-505 floated under tow, her bow rising and falling with each wave. She had been the pride of the Kriegsmarine, a symbol of German ingenuity and naval terror. Now, she was an exhibit, a tool, a reminder of what had been lost. Every German sailor aboard Guadalcanal could feel it, the psychological blow of watching a weapon of their own creation treated with indifference, respect, and efficiency. In the intelligence compartment, Lang caught sight of a young American officer carefully photographing the U-boat's control panels, making notes in neat, deliberate handwriting. The young man didn't rush, didn't panic. Each click of the camera, each annotation, felt like a punishment in slow motion. "We've already beaten you," Lang muttered under his breath. "And we didn't even know it." Some German sailors tried to rationalize, tried to cling to old pride. They whispered among themselves about tactical errors, about luck, about the timing of depth charges. But deep down, everyone knew the truth. The Atlantic was no longer theirs to fight over. It had been mapped, understood, and mastered. As night fell again, the German crew gathered on the deck, watching the fleet move with silent, terrifying coordination. Planes took off, planes landed, destroyers patrolled, and carriers hummed like mechanical giants. The ocean was calm. The sea was silent. And yet, everywhere they looked, there was control, omnipresent, omniscient, undeniable. Lang's mind wandered back to the moment of U-505's capture. The strange disbelief of the boarding, the careful handling of their vessel, the merciless efficiency of American planning. He understood now that the Americans had shifted the paradigm of naval warfare. Victory was no longer about courage alone, or stealth, or even strategy in isolation. It was about infrastructure, intelligence, and absolute command over every variable. And in that realization, Lang felt a profound, almost physical loss. Not of life that had been spared, but of purpose, pride, and dominance. The Atlantic War had been decided long before they surfaced. The men of U-505 had survived the depths, only to be defeated by foresight and control. Somewhere across the ship, a German sailor whispered, voice barely audible, "Is this how the war ends?" The answer hung in the salty night air. Not with explosions or heroics, not with daring attacks or desperate maneuvers, but with the enemy walking through your ship, unafraid, and taking everything you thought you owned. And for the men of U-505, that was the most bitter defeat of all. The harsh clarity of reality. Days passed aboard the USS Guadalcanal, yet for the German crew of U-505, each one felt longer than a year at sea. The Atlantic no longer held mystery, suspense, or opportunity. It had become a stage on which the Americans demonstrated control, predictability, and power. Captain Lieutenant Lang spent hours observing the operations. Every radar sweep, every sonar ping, every launch and recovery of aircraft, every orderly supply, transfer impressed upon him the scale of the logistical and technological mastery he was witnessing. The Americans were not improvising, not reacting, they were orchestrating. During a briefing, Lang saw officers pointing to charts of convoy routes, annotated with intelligence gleaned from captured U-boats and code-breaking efforts. The Germans had no illusions left. Every route they had taken, every tactic they had deployed, was already known, anticipated, and neutralized. Unteroffizier Klaus Weber, sitting beside Lang, muttered under his breath, "They know everything we do." Lang didn't respond. He knew it was true. For years, the Kriegsmarine had prided itself on stealth, on the fear U-boats inspired. Now, that illusion had evaporated. What remained was a stark, almost clinical defeat, not in combat, but in foresight, in preparation, in the scale of enemy operations. The captured U-505, meanwhile, had become a center of quiet obsession. American crews meticulously inspected every compartment, every gauge, every torpedo tube. Engineers tested mechanisms, technicians mapped the boat's design, and intelligence officers pored over every document, every chart, every page of codebooks that had survived the scuttling attempts. From a German perspective, it was excruciating to watch. Men who had spent years believing their vessels were instruments of terror now saw them turned into tools of study, dissected and mastered by the enemy they had once feared. Lang began to understand the magnitude of the psychological blow. It was one thing to survive a depth charge attack or to evade a hunter-killer group. It was another entirely to watch the enemy handle your weapon as though it were already theirs, untouched, unafraid, and operational. That night, Lang sat on the deck of Guadalcanal, staring into the horizon. The moon cast long shadows over a sea that was no longer a place of danger, but of complete dominance. He thought of every U-boat lost, every convoy ambushed, every patrol undertaken. All of it seemed futile now. The Americans had engineered an ocean they could control, and he and his crew had been caught inside it like minnows in a tank. Weber came to sit beside him, voice low and trembling. Do you think they'll ever lose?" Lang did not answer immediately. He thought of the relentless patrols, the precision of aircraft operations, the intelligence networks, the repair and logistical systems that seemed infinite. He thought of U-505, once a symbol of German ingenuity, now a captured and cataloged trophy. He knew the truth. The war for the Atlantic had already been decided. The realization was almost unbearable. It was not dramatic, not cinematic, not the sort of loss celebrated in stories of heroism. It was quiet, methodical, and total. And in that quiet, Lang recognized something else. The Americans were not just winning battles. They were winning the perception of the sea itself. Every U-boat in the Atlantic was now a potential source of intelligence. Every convoy attack, every patrol, every encounter could be anticipated and countered. The Germans were no longer hunters. They were cataloged prey. Morning brought inspections, reports, and briefings. Every German sailor was forced to confront the depth of their defeat. Maps, tactics, machinery, codebooks, everything had been seized, measured, understood. Even the pride of the Kriegsmarine had been taken. And yet, amidst this meticulous control, there was no malice, no anger, no rush to execute revenge. The Americans moved with the confidence of men who already knew the outcome, who did not need to prove dominance with blood or fire. It was worse than any battlefield defeat Lang had ever imagined. There were no explosions, no depth charges, no glory, only control, mastery, and inevitability. And somewhere deep in him, a chilling thought took root. If the Americans could capture a U-boat, preserve it, and use it to study their enemy, then the war had already been lost. Long before the first torpedo struck, long before the Atlantic echoed with the cries of battle. A world behind enemy lines. Weeks passed, and the German crew of U-505 began to move beyond the immediate shock of capture. The Atlantic, once a battleground, had become a floating city under American dominion, and their role had shifted from combatants to observers. Captain Lieutenant Lang was escorted through the Guadalcanal's operations room, a cavernous space filled with flickering radar screens and humming plotting tables. Sailors tracked convoys, monitored aircraft, and coordinated destroyer patrols with a calm efficiency that bordered on the surreal. Each movement, each decision was precise, measured, inevitable. It was as though the Atlantic itself had been rewritten, no longer a sea of opportunity, but a controlled machine. Below decks, the U-505 team observed American engineers testing torpedo mechanisms, inspecting every gauge and lever, cataloging the internal layout of the submarine. Every tool, every bolt, every document was scrutinized. The Germans could only watch, in disbelief. Their pride, their expertise, their years of training, all being dissected and repurposed by men they had once feared. One of the younger sailors, Unteroffizier Weber, whispered, voice shaking, "They're not just studying the boat, they're studying us." Lange nodded grimly. He realized Weber was right. Every question asked, every procedure demonstrated, every inspection was a lesson in psychological dominance. The Americans had turned the capture into a strategic victory that extended beyond the physical submarine. It was a blow to morale, confidence, and the very notion of German naval superiority. As the days stretched on, the Germans were allowed to witness carrier operations firsthand. Aircraft took off and landed with clockwork precision. Engineers refueled and repaired planes mid-deck. Every destroyer patrolled tirelessly, every movement choreographed. The Germans had imagined this fleet as a chaotic force, perhaps as desperate as themselves. But the reality was an oceanic fortress, self-sustaining and absolute. Lang and his men began to understand the full scope of what had been captured with U-505. The Enigma machine and codebooks were more than trophies. They were keys to decoding years of German operations, understanding convoy routes, patrol strategies, and even the timing of U-boat attacks. The Americans now held the blueprint to the Atlantic War, and the Kriegsmarine's pride, expertise, and secrecy had been rendered obsolete. At night, as the Germans huddled under blankets on the flight deck, the sea around them seemed silent, yet suffocating. The once threatening expanse was now a stage of control. Waves lapped against the hull with predictable rhythm. Radar masts and antennas glinted under the moonlight. The distant hum of engines and the soft chatter of American sailors created a lullaby that was terrifying in its normalcy. Lang's mind wandered back to the moment of capture, when the boarding party had climbed onto U-505. They had expected destruction, fury, perhaps a final act of violence. Instead, they were met with calm efficiency, measured action, and deliberate mercy. The Americans had not just captured a submarine. They had captured the narrative of the Atlantic War itself. He thought of every U-boat lost, every convoy attacked, every long, desperate patrol through the cold North Atlantic. All of it now seemed insignificant, a series of small events in a theater already dominated by an enemy whose foresight, infrastructure, and technological mastery far outstripped anything the Germans could muster. Weber spoke again, barely above a whisper. They're living in a different world down here. One we can't fight. Lang didn't answer. He only stared at the endless horizon, the controlled chaos of the fleet moving as one, and the dark silhouette of U-505 being towed, still intact, still alive, still proof of what they had lost. In that moment, he realized something deeper than defeat. It wasn't just that U-505 had been captured. It wasn't just that the Americans had gained intelligence. It was that the Kriegsmarine had already lost the psychological war for the Atlantic. The enemy could walk through their vessel, catalog their secrets, manipulate the ocean, and do it all with a calm that was more terrifying than a storm or a depth charge. Lang closed his eyes. He could almost hear the Atlantic itself whispering the truth. The tides had shifted, and there was no turning them back. And somewhere deep inside, he knew the war was over long before he had even surfaced. The quiet triumph. By August 1944, the German crew of U-505 had fully come to grips with the scale of what they had witnessed. The Atlantic, once a theater where they had imagined themselves predators, now lay submissive beneath the American fleet. The very notion of German dominance seemed almost absurd in retrospect. Captain Lieutenant Lang walked the deck of the USS Guadalcanal in the early morning fog. Waves lapped gently against the hull, but there was no fear, no danger, only order, efficiency, and relentless purpose. Around him, aircraft crews prepared for sorties with precision. Destroyers moved like clockwork, and intelligence officers studied every blip, every trace, every detail of the Atlantic theater. Every possible variable was accounted for. U-505, once a symbol of German engineering and terror, had been transformed into a tool of insight. Engineers and technicians moved inside her compartments, measuring, testing, cataloging. Every instrument, every torpedo tube, every Enigma rotor had been recorded and reproduced in American intelligence logs. The submarine that had struck fear into convoys and patrols was now a cataloged exhibit, a silent testament to the Allies' mastery. The Germans were allowed to observe, though not to interfere. They saw firsthand how intelligence gleaned from captured U-boats had already reshaped Allied convoy strategies. Operations that once seemed daring and unpredictable were now scripted and controlled by an invisible hand. Every risk they had ever taken, every patrol they had executed, every convoy they had attacked had been accounted for, analyzed, and neutralized in advance. Unteroffizier Weber sat on the flight deck beside Lang, watching the fleet's methodical movements. "They're not even fighting the war," he whispered. "They're living it." "Yes," Lang said, voice tight. "And they've already won it." For the German sailors, the psychological weight of this truth was almost unbearable. They had survived scuttling charges, depth charge attacks, freezing water, and the crushing pressure of the deep Atlantic. Yet none of that mattered. The Americans had achieved a victory without firing a single shot at their captured crew. The lesson was clear. War was no longer about survival or skill, but about foresight, infrastructure, and relentless control. That evening, Lang returned to U-505. He ran his hands along the familiar railings, the hatch, the deck, now smooth under American hands. The submarine had survived, intact, operational, yet every inch of her was under enemy command. It was a strange and painful sight. This was not the destruction he had anticipated, not the fiery end that every U-boat captain expected. Instead, it was quiet, controlled, and absolute. In the fading light, the German crew gathered together. They looked out at the fleet, the carriers, the destroyers, the aircraft, a floating city of steel and order. No explosions, no frantic panic, no chaos, just the hum of mastery realized. Lang understood fully now. The Atlantic had already been decided. The Kriegsmarine had lost not on the decks of their submarines or in the chaos of battle, but in the laboratories, command rooms, and coordinated operations of the enemy. U-505's capture was not just a tactical victory. It was a psychological one, a demonstration of complete dominance. Somewhere deep in his mind, Lang whispered the truth he could no longer ignore. We were never in control. We were only ever surviving. And now, the ocean belongs to them. The German sailors remained on deck long into the night, watching lights flicker across the vast Atlantic, watching a fleet that did not panic, did not hesitate, and did not fear the sea. They had seen the future of naval warfare, and it was terrifying in its efficiency, in its certainty, in its cold, implacable logic. For the men of U-505, that quiet triumph, the complete mastery of the Atlantic by an enemy who moved with unshakable purpose, was far more devastating than any sinking, any battle lost, any depth charge exploded. It was a defeat that would linger for the rest of the war and for the rest of their lives. And as the ocean stretched endlessly before them, calm, controlled, and claimed by the Americans, Lang realized something that would haunt him forever. They had survived the depths, only to witness the enemy walking through their war, untouched and triumphant.